More than 500 locations belonging to some of the most recognizable restaurant chains in the country have closed over the past 2 years. And what's remarkable is that many of these brands were once considered nearly impossible to fail. 12 well known restaurant chains in America are facing serious trouble right now. But the problem isn't that people have stopped eating out. The problem is that they're thinking a lot harder before opening their wallets. As the cost of living continues to rise and families start cutting back on expenses that aren't truly necessary, even the most familiar brands are beginning to show some troubling signs. And a few of the names coming up may surprise you the most. 12. Dairy Queen. 37. Dairy Queen locations in Texas closed within just a matter of weeks. Some of those restaurants had been serving customers for more than 50 years, half a century, longer than the lifespan of many American businesses. And what makes this story noteworthy isn't that Dairy Queen is a small chain struggling to survive. Texas still has more Dairy Queen locations than any other state in the country. This is one of the brands most deeply connected to life in small town America. That's why when dozens of familiar locations disappear in such a short period of time, many people see it as a sign that something bigger is changing. Because for millions of people, Dairy Queen was never just a place to buy ice cream. It was where families stopped on summer evenings, where countless kids got their first blizzard as a reward for something special. For years, small moments like those helped Dairy Queen build an identity that was uniquely its own. It wasn't just ice cream, it was memories, but behind those closures is a reality becoming increasingly common across the restaurant industry. Labor costs are rising, operating costs are rising, equipment and store upgrades are becoming more expensive. At the same time, many small towns aren't growing the way they once did. Customer traffic isn't increasing fast enough to justify ever larger investments. And that's when the pressure starts to build. Most customers don't follow disputes between corporate offices and franchise operators. They only see the final result. A familiar location disappears, a notice posted on the front door, a parking lot that's emptier than it used to be. That's the moment many people realize the place no longer feels the way they remember it. Some customers feel the quality isn't as consistent as it once was. Others feel prices are rising faster than the value they're getting in return. And when those feelings start appearing at the same time, loyalty to the brand begins to weaken. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this story is that it isn't really about ice cream. It's about communities where a simple restaurant once served as a gathering place for the entire town. And when places like that begin to disappear, many people feel like a familiar piece of America is disappearing with them. Maybe that's why Dairy Queen comes in at number 12 on today's list. 11. Golden Corral. One of Golden Corral's largest franchise operators recently filed for bankruptcy with nearly $50 million in unsecured debt. Multiple locations were forced to close. And for a buffet chain that was once considered a symbol of affordable family dining in America, that's a more significant warning sign than many people realize. Because Golden Corral was never famous for expensive food, it was famous for a feeling, the feeling of abundance. There was a time when about $15 could get you through the door and make it feel like an entire restaurant was laid out in front of you. Steak, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, mac and cheese, a salad bar, and of course, the chocolate fountain that almost every kid seemed to remember, not because it was the best restaurant in the country, but because it felt like you were getting more than what you paid for. That's why, for years, Golden Corral became a familiar destination after church on Sundays, a place where grandparents, parents, and grandchildren could all sit at the same table without worrying too much about the bill. But in recent years, things have started to change. COVID changed the way many people viewed self-service buffets. At the same time, food costs, labor costs, and operating expenses continued climbing. Many locations have struggled to maintain profitability, but the biggest challenge may not be the buffet model itself. It may be what's happening to the American middle class, because Golden Corral thrived during periods when families wanted to save money but still enjoy the feeling of eating out. Today, many families are facing tougher choices. Food costs are up, rent is up, insurance is up, utility bills are up. And when every expense rises at the same time, even meals that once felt affordable start getting reconsidered. Many longtime customers don't say they dislike Golden Corral. They simply say they don't visit as often as they used to. And that's a huge difference because sometimes a brand doesn't lose customers because people stop loving it. It loses them because their lives have changed. Maybe the most thought provoking image isn't a restaurant closing, it's a family that once visited Golden Corral several times a month. Now they only stop by a few times a year, not because they want to, but because they have to. Golden Corral built its reputation on offering a feeling of abundance at a price ordinary families could afford. And perhaps that's the very thing that's slowly disappearing. What do you remember most about the Golden Corral of years past? 10. Five Guys. A receipt approaching $25 for a burger, fries, and a soft drink has sparked plenty of debate across the country. But what's interesting is that the most common reaction isn't, "That's too expensive." It's not worth it anymore. And that's a very important difference because Five Guys was never the cheapest option. For years, customers were willing to pay more because they felt like they were getting more in return. Bigger burgers, fresher ingredients, and those famous fries that often spilled out of the cup and covered the bottom of the bag. That was part of the brand's identity. You weren't just buying food, you were buying the feeling that your money was well spent. But over the past few years, prices have started climbing much faster than many customers expected. Beef costs went up, labor costs went up, operating costs went up, and menu prices followed. Today, a family of four can easily spend $70 or $80 on a meal at Five Guys. That's when many people begin asking an uncomfortable question. If even a burger meal has become this expensive, what still counts as a reasonable value? Maybe that's the real reason Five Guys appears on today's list, because this story isn't really about burgers, it's about trust. The trust that the money you're spending still delivers the value you expect in return. And when that trust begins to weaken, loyalty often weakens with it. What surprises you more? The price of Five Guys today, or the fact that more and more people feel it simply isn't worth the money anymore? 9. Applebee's. For years, Applebee's was known as the neighborhood restaurant, not because the food was extraordinary, not because the menu was exceptional, but because it was always there, a place to meet friends after work, a place to take the family out for dinner, a place you could stop by without giving it much thought. That's why Applebee's grew so successfully across the country. But today, customer traffic and sales at many locations are gradually declining. And what's interesting is that Applebee's isn't really losing to one specific competitor. It's losing to a much bigger shift. People don't get together the way they used to. Happy hour isn't as crowded as it once was. Spontaneous dinners after work happen less often. More people head straight home. More people order food for delivery. More people are simply too busy or too tired to go out. It's a small change, but when millions of people change their habits at the same time, the impact becomes enormous. There was a time when walking into Applebee's on a Friday night meant waiting for a table. Conversations filled the dining room. The bar area was packed. The parking lot was nearly full. Today, in many places, that scene isn't nearly as common. And that's what makes this story worth thinking about. Applebee's isn't just losing customers. It's losing the role it once played in the everyday lives of middle class families. Because sometimes a brand doesn't struggle because it changed. It struggles because everything around it changed. Do you still have a place like Applebee's in your neighborhood? Or are those kinds of get togethers becoming less common where you live? 8. Ruby Tuesday. There was a time when Ruby Tuesday operated more than 900 restaurants across the country. No matter where you traveled, there was a good chance you'd come across one. Today, only a fraction of those locations remain. And what's interesting is that many people don't even realize it's happening. Because Ruby Tuesday didn't decline the way most people imagine, there were no shocking headlines, no bankruptcy stories that dominated the news. No long lines of disappointed customers outside the doors. It simply faded away, one location at a time, one year at a time, until many people suddenly realized that the restaurant they had visited for years was no longer there. That's what makes the Ruby Tuesday story different. For decades, it was one of the most familiar names in American casual dining, a place to meet friends, a place to take the family out for dinner, a place that felt like part of everyday life. But as more competitors entered the market, as dining habits changed, and as customers gained more and more choices, Ruby Tuesday gradually lost the place it once held. Not because customers hated it, but because they slowly forgot about it. And that may be one of the hardest endings for any brand to avoid, because sometimes the biggest danger isn't being rejected by customers, it's no longer being remembered. Ruby Tuesday isn't really a story about a restaurant chain. It's a story about how a brand that once seemed to be everywhere can slowly disappear right in front of us, while almost nobody notices. When was the last time you remember seeing a Ruby Tuesday? 7. Hooters. At the beginning of 2025, Hooters filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection as part of a restructuring effort. For many people, it wasn't exactly a surprise because Hooters' biggest challenge may not be sales, it may be identity. There was a time when Hooters was a familiar part of sports bar culture across the country: game day, chicken wings, cold beer, big screens showing every major matchup, and a brand image that almost everyone recognized instantly, whether people loved it or not. Hooters occupied a place all its own. But the problems began when the country started changing. Customers changed, expectations changed, and the way people chose places to meet friends changed as well. At the same time, Hooters struggled to answer a very simple question. If you take away the things that originally made the brand famous, what is left? That's the same question many customers are asking themselves. Because today, if someone wants to watch sports, they have countless options. If they want chicken wings, they have countless options. If they want a sports bar, they have even more options. And when the differences start to fade, the brand begins to struggle. That's why the Hooters story isn't really about bankruptcy. It's about an identity crisis. Because when a brand no longer knows exactly what it stands for, customers stop knowing why they should come back. What do you think was the one thing that made Hooters stand out from every other sports bar? 6. Denny's. During 2024 and 2025, Denny's announced plans to close dozens of underperforming locations across the country. For many people, that's simply a restaurant chain shrinking its footprint. But for those who remember America a few decades ago, this story carries a different meaning. Because Denny's was never just a restaurant, it was the place that was always open. 2 a.m., 3 a.m. holidays, Christmas Eve, or those moments when almost everywhere else had already turned off the lights. If you've ever worked the night shift, driven a long haul truck across multiple states, or sat in a hospital waiting room after midnight, there's a good chance you've stepped into a Denny's at some point. A hot cup of coffee, a grand slam breakfast, a brightly lit place in the middle of the night. That's the role a Denny's played in the lives of millions of people. But America is different today. After the pandemic, more and more businesses abandoned the 24-hour model. Labor costs increased, staffing shortages persisted, operating expenses climbed higher, and the places that once stayed open all night began shortening their hours or closing altogether. What's interesting is that Denny's isn't the only chain facing this challenge, but it may be one of the clearest symbols of it, because for years, Denny's represented a very simple idea: that no matter what was happening in your life, no matter what time the clock said, there would always be a place with the lights on waiting for you. Today, that feeling is slowly disappearing, and perhaps the most thought provoking part isn't the number of restaurants closing, it's the fact that fewer and fewer places still exist for people whose lives happen outside the traditional schedule. Denny's once symbolized an America that never slept, and maybe that's what's really changing. When was the last time you found yourself sitting in a Denny's at midnight? 5. Cracker Barrel. Customer traffic at Cracker Barrel has declined for several consecutive quarters. That's a concerning number for any restaurant chain. But for Cracker Barrel, the problem may run much deeper than that. Because customers never came here just for the food. They came for a feeling. The rocking chairs on the front porch, the antique decorations hanging on the walls, Sunday mornings with grandparents, and the sense that the place looked exactly the same as it did the last time you visited years ago. That's what made Cracker Barrel different. In a world that never stopped changing, it offered a sense of stability. But over the past few years, many customers have started feeling that something isn't quite the same. Prices have gone up. Some changes to the brand's image have sparked debate. And more importantly, a growing number of people feel they can no longer find the sense of familiarity they once loved. That's a very difficult problem to solve because if a customer doesn't like the food, you can change the menu. If they complain about prices, you can launch promotions. But if they feel the place no longer resembles what they remember, the challenge becomes far more complicated. What's interesting is that Cracker Barrel doesn't really sell breakfast or fried chicken. It sells memories, it sells tradition, it sells the feeling of returning to a familiar moment in life. And that's why even small changes can trigger strong reactions from longtime customers because they don't want a new Cracker Barrel. They want the Cracker Barrel they've known for years. Some restaurants lose customers because of the food. Cracker Barrel risks losing customers because it's losing the sense of familiarity that made people love it in the first place. When you think about Cracker Barrel, what do you remember most? The food or the atmosphere that made it feel so different from everywhere else? 4. TGI Fridays. There was a time when TGI Fridays operated more than 600 restaurants across the country. Today, only a fraction of those locations remain. Many restaurants have closed in recent years, and for a brand that once helped define America's dining culture, that's a significant change because TGI Fridays was never just a restaurant. From the very beginning, the brand was selling an idea. Thank God it's Friday. The work week is finally over. It's finally time to meet up with friends, enjoy a meal, and relax for the evening. That's why millions of people loved the place, not because of the burgers, not because of the cocktails, but because it gave them the feeling that they had something worth celebrating. There was a time when a Friday night at many TGI Fridays locations meant waiting for a table. The parking lot was full, the bar area was packed. But over the past few years, more and more families have started cutting back on expenses that aren't absolutely necessary, and celebration dinners often end up on that list. What's interesting is that customers aren't saying they hate TGI Fridays. They're simply visiting less often because sometimes a brand doesn't struggle because people stop loving it. It struggles because people no longer feel comfortable spending money on things that once felt completely normal. And perhaps that's the biggest pain point for TGI Fridays today. It's not that the restaurants are disappearing, it's that the moments that once brought people there are becoming less common. More and more people are starting to view a Friday night celebration dinner as an expense that needs to be carefully considered. When was the last time you truly celebrated something on a Friday night? 3. Olive Garden. A family of four can easily spend anywhere from $80 to well over $100 on dinner at Olive Garden today. That's not a shocking number for an upscale restaurant, but Olive Garden was never built to be an upscale restaurant. And that's exactly what makes this story interesting. For decades, Olive Garden held a very specific place in the lives of middle-class families. It wasn't where people went for the most important celebrations, but it wasn't somewhere you rushed through a quick meal either. It lived in the middle, a place where families could treat themselves after a long week, a place for a Saturday night dinner, a place where parents could take their kids and still feel like it fit the budget. And of course, there were the unlimited breadsticks that millions of people still remember. Olive Garden never really sold pasta. It sold the feeling that you were doing something special for yourself and your family. But over the past few years, many customers have started feeling a growing gap between that feeling and their reality. Living costs are up, grocery bills are up, housing costs are up, insurance costs are up, And when every expense rises at the same time, the small rewards in life start becoming purchases that need to be carefully considered. What's interesting is that many customers don't say they dislike Olive Garden. They still like the breadsticks, they still like the salad, they still enjoy the familiar atmosphere. They just don't visit as often as they used to. Because sometimes the problem isn't the restaurant, it's that customers' lives have changed. There was a time when a family could decide to stop at Olive Garden on a whim without thinking much about it. Today, many families find themselves looking at the budget first before making the same decision. And perhaps that's Olive Garden's biggest challenge right now. Not the pasta, not the breadsticks, but the fact that the small rewards that once felt normal for middle class families are becoming something that requires more thought. Olive Garden used to be a place where people could treat themselves without feeling financial pressure. And perhaps the most telling sign is that more and more people no longer feel that way. Do you think Olive Garden still feels special the way it once did, or has it become an expense that many families have to think much harder about today? 2. Red Lobster. In 2024, Red Lobster filed for bankruptcy protection and closed more than 100 restaurants across the country. It was one of the biggest shocks the restaurant industry had seen in years. But what's interesting is that the Red Lobster story isn't really about seafood, it's about special occasions. For decades, Red Lobster was where many families went to celebrate a birthday, an anniversary, a graduation, or simply treat themselves to something a little nicer than usual. That's what made Red Lobster different. It wasn't a luxury restaurant, but it wasn't a budget restaurant either. It occupied the space in between, a place where middle class families could enjoy something that felt special without spending like they were dining at a high end restaurant. For years, that formula worked extremely well. Then things started to change. Food costs increased, operating costs increased. A series of controversial financial decisions put additional pressure on the company. And eventually, those problems built into the crisis we see today. But perhaps the most thought provoking part of the story isn't found in the financial reports, it's found in the customers because more and more families are cutting back on spending for special occasions. When housing costs go up, insurance costs go up, grocery bills go up. The dinners that once felt like rewards suddenly become expenses that require careful consideration. And that may be Red Lobster's biggest challenge, not the lobster, not the seafood, but the fact that the special occasions that once felt normal for middle class families are becoming increasingly expensive. Some brands lose customers because people stop liking them. Red Lobster may be struggling because fewer people feel financially comfortable enough to celebrate the way they once did. Do you remember a special occasion that brought you to Red Lobster? 1. Boston Market. There was a time when Boston Market operated more than 1,100 restaurants across the country. Today, most of that system has all but disappeared. Lawsuits, debt problems, locations shutting down without warning, employees arriving for work only to find the doors locked. It has been one of the most remarkable restaurant collapses the industry has seen in years. But the reason this story sits at number one isn't the scale of the collapse. It's what the brand once represented. Boston Market was never famous for one particular menu item. It was famous for family dinner, rotisserie chicken, mashed potatoes, corn, gravy, simple meals that millions of families brought home after a long day at work. For years, Boston Market solved a very practical problem. You didn't have time to cook, but you still wanted your family to sit down to something that felt like a home-cooked meal. That's what made the brand special. It occupied a unique space, not quite a restaurant, not exactly fast food, but a solution for the busy lives of American families. Then, over time, operational problems began piling up. Debt increased, the system weakened. One location after another disappeared. And along with them went something familiar in the lives of millions of people. What's interesting is that Boston Market wasn't really selling rotisserie chicken. It was selling the idea that no matter how busy life became, families could still gather around a decent dinner together. Out of every restaurant on today's list, which brand would you miss the most if it disappeared completely one day? Looking back at the entire list today, the most interesting thing may not be any one restaurant on its own, because people still want to share meals with their families. They still want to meet up with friends. They still want special dinners to celebrate the moments that matter most. What's changing is that the places that once helped create those memories aren't holding the same place they once did. Some are losing customers, some are losing their identity, some are slowly disappearing. But all of them reflect an America that is changing. Out of all the names on today's list, which restaurant would you miss the most if it disappeared completely one day? Share your thoughts in the comments below.